yo no hablo bien español, entonces yo cambio para el inglés. Es más fácil para mí, no es así fácil para ustedes, más conferencias internacionales, congresos internacionales, necesita de una lengua común. Esto es la lengua de los gringos. Esto tal vez es una expresión del imperialismo lingüístico moderno, mas es una necesidad de hablar inglés. Well, dear colleagues, the question which has been raised is the influence of Ernest Mandel in the formation of the European left. And when I got the invitation to participate in this event, of course I said yes, I come, because I know Ernest Mandel since I considered how long I knew him, and I found out I met him first time 1967. That was when I was a student. Now I was already an assistant student at the University of Erlangen in Nuremberg, where Ernest Mandel was a famous person coming from abroad. Belgium, those times was for Germans abroad. Coming from abroad, and one of those very few persons which do not exist in Germany in those times, who are traditional Marxists. And so Ernest Mandel was there, gave a talk, and it was very, very interesting, because he not only presented Marxist thinking, but also gave an analysis of the economic situation of Europe and of Germany, and interpretation of the political situation, as well as on the social conflicts going on in Europe in those times. And these conflicts, 1967, were not very harsh, were not very hard, were very soft conflicts. That was before the '68 revolt at the European universities, and then at the universities worldwide, also in Mexico, you remember very well, broke out. It was before the French May of '68. It was before the Autunno Caldo, the warm autumn, or the autumn in Italy. It was before the wildcat strikes in Germany, which took place before the election to the German parliament in September 1969. There was not so much class struggle, and then Ernest Mandel came and said, perhaps there is no class struggle today, but there was class struggle, and there was hard class conflicts in the past, and it will so be in the future. And you have to prepare yourself to the coming conflicts of classes in the world. That was a message which he gave. It was not only an analysis which he did, it was to a certain part a theoretical analysis, it was a political evaluation, and it was political agitation. And it was very successful. I remember very well that the audience at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, a provincial university in downtown Germany, in Bavaria, that the students were enthusiastic about his speech. That was Ernest Mandel. And then I met him very often in those years, and I was appointed to be one of the participants, the members of the doctoral commission, the commission which should make the exam, the doctoral exam of Ernest Mandel in 1972. And then the intrigues began. That was in those times when the class struggle began. So May '68 already happened, and the hot autumn in Italy and the class struggles in Fiat began, and in Germany the spontaneous wildcat strikes also took place. And then the government of Germany, red liberal government, social liberal government, which has been called Willy Brandt, who is well known, and Genscher, the liberal Minister of Interior, they said that Ernest Mandel shall be banned from Germany, from entering in Germany. And therefore he couldn't come to Germany. And why did they do that? First of all, they did it because other countries also did it. Then Ernest Mandel to enter the specific countries. That was France, that was the United States, that was Great Britain, and then Germany also, and some other smaller countries in Europe, as Austria, for instance, but also the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc in those times. Also, he was banned from there, with one exception, and the one exception, that was Yugoslavia. There he could enter, but all the other countries, that was impossible. And why did they ban him? First of all, everybody did it, and the second, he was a very dangerous person. He was dangerous because he influenced, that was the saying of the conservatives, he was responsible for the May '68 in Paris, because he was the most efficient agitator in those upheavals on the streets in Paris, and therefore he should be banned. And then there was another question, that is a specific German one. He got an offer by the Free University, my university in those times of Berlin, to be a visiting professor for a year at the university. And that was an invitation which the government wouldn't allow, tried to hinder by this ban from the entry into Germany. And so Ernest Mandel was hindered to travel freely in this free world, in this free Europe, in this united Europe, in this integrating Europe. The European Economic Community already existed. It was on the beginning of the European Community, and today we have the European Union. The process of integration, of free trade, free migration within Europe, and then Ernest Mandel was hindered to migrate freely and to do his work, also his political work freely. And that was one of the reasons why the student movement, which was a listener to Ernest Mandel's speeches, to his agitation, also to his propaganda, we have to say, but also to his theoretical writings, which are of utmost of highest quality. And then the student movement and other social movements in those times, they went on the streets to demonstrate in favor of Ernest Mandel for the freedom of voyage, the freedom of migrating within Europe, but only with success in '78 when this ban has been finished. That is the story which is the most superficial one, and we have to look what is more than this story with Ernest Mandel and his power, as the title of this speech promises, his power of disseminating Marxist thinking and Marxist interpretations in post-war Europe. And when we
Sorry, I can't hear you if you don't speak into the microphone. Thank you.
I tried not only to observe the contents of the speech, but also the technical mode to communicate. That's what I have to say. Ernest Mandel, we have to take into consideration what was the situation in post-war Europe when Ernest Mandel began his political work. And he began his political work very early in his life. He was forced to do that. He was forced to do that by the Nazi regime in the Second World War. You know that he has been born in 1923. He was 22 years old when the war, the Second World War, was over, and he was 15, 16 years when it began. So he was a very young person, but completely affected, like any adult person, by these development. And that was what formed his life. And so his life was perhaps something like a mirror of the whole 20th century, which has been called by Eric Hobsbawm, the great Marxist historian, an age of extremes. And I think we do not wrong when we say that also the life of Ernest Mandel was a life of extremes. Not because he was an extremist and wanted a life of extremes, but because he was forced to suffer, sometimes to suffer, under a life of extremes. Under German Nazism and the occupation of Belgium, he had to suffer because he has put into prison several times in Belgium. Before, in 1944, the Nazis put him into a concentration camp in Germany, where he has been freed by the Allied forces only at the end of the war of 1945. As a resistance fighter, he helped to preserve a part, at least, of the traditions of the labor movement and of Marxism against the Nazis, which tried to eradicate all the roots of Marxist thinking, critical thinking in general, and to liquidate those who were the promoters of these ideas. So we have to was defined or determined by the situation in the middle of the last century. But we have also to take into consideration that he, at the end of the Second World War, knew a lot about the evils of Stalinism in the Soviet Union and also in the Western Communist parties. So it was not surprising that he joined the Trotskyist movement already in the 40s, and that he later belonged to the leadership of the Trotskyist Fourth International until his death in 1995. He was next to Isaac Deutscher, one of their most internationally known representatives. This was partly because he belonged to an open, undogmatic, left socialist line that allowed many relations to social democratic or also communist movements and parties in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. Following the strategy of entrism of the Trotskyist movement, he became a member of the Socialist Party in Belgium. He was not only a Trotskyist but also a socialist or a social democrat. Many German Trotskyists did the same in newly founded West Germany, they entered as Trotskyists, SPD, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and the trade unions. After the Second World War, as a Belgian with German origin, he knew very precisely the situation with the new Federal Republic of Germany. He knew about the difficulties for socialists and communists in the Adenauer era, the former Chancellor of Germany, Konrad Adenauer. It was a regime dominated by a crude anti-communism, which could base its anti-communist ideology on an economic miracle, which in 1957 gave the Christian Democrats, the Christian Democratic Union, an absolute majority in the Bundestag elections. During this time, the Communist Party, the traditional Communist Party, was banned as unconstitutional. The unions had fired their left intellectuals, and the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, stood on the path to the party congress of Godesberg, where the party, at the end of the 50s, 1959, buried their socialist ideas and decided about a new and modernized party program. That was a situation in Germany which Ernest Mandel knew very well. For a Marxist who was on top of the course international, Germany was now simple. However, it was an open area, simply accessible from the neighboring Belgium, where Ernest Mandel had his residence. In Germany, the political terrain was completely extra-parliamentarian. There was no left-wing parliamentary opposition ever since the Communist Party has been banned in the 50s. This only changed at the beginning of the 1980s, 3 decades later, when the Greens at that time, as a left party, succeeded to overcome the 5% hurdle to the Bundestag. No wonder that also the writings of Ernest Mandel, when we take his life into consideration, were time-bound. He intervened into the current theoretical and political debates always with passion. The most important publications of Ernest Mandel were written in the years after the Second World War, first during the so-called Trente Glorieuses, the glorious 30 years, until the mid-1970s, and in the early years of the crisis, which began already in the 60s. Before the outbreak of the economic crisis, this was the period of the economic miracle in Western Europe, of the prosperity in the United States, and of the fast-growing planned economies of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The so-called Third World, Latin America, Africa, Asia, freed itself of the imperialist yoke and made the first, and in many cases failed, attempt to overcome the development of underdevelopment. You remember the famous phrase of Henri Gundal-Frank, by establishing a system that later has been labeled the development state, or the planning system of the development state. The economic miracle seemed to grant post-war capitalism a new era of flowering and of economic, social and political stability. The work of Franz Jánossy, not so known today as it was in the 60s. He was Hungarian and a stepson of Georg Lukács. And his work on the end of the economic miracles, in plural, was trying to find the reasons for the steep upswing and the high growth rates in Europe of the first post-war decades, and at the same time to show that the period of the economic miracles in the 1960s was coming to an end. For the so-called reconstruction period in the post-war period was over, followed by a transitional period in which capitalism returned to the normality of the accumulation cycle, of booms and busts, prosperity and crisis. Now, there were many attempts to connect on Marx and the Marxist tradition again. Again, because in many countries, since the fascist dictatorships, a critical debate did not exist anymore. The theory of the Reconstruction period had a certain plausibility and also enough charm which explained its attractiveness, especially in the young student movement of the 1960s. Young people of 20 to 25 years only knew a capitalism which was crisis-free and fast-growing, a capitalism which was known as a free and social market economy. The word capitalism disappeared from the discourses. The concept of the Reconstruction period failed in understanding the class contradictions of the capitalist process of accumulation and to give convincing interpretations of the components of value, capital, value added, organic composition of capital, value product, surplus value, wages. Instead, the theory of reconstruction put technology and skills in the theoretical focus. That was a theoretical restriction for any analysis of the post-war accumulation process, which Ernest Mandel was not willing to accept. Instead, the historical changes had to be taken into account. The economic structure of monopoly capital, the power shift due to the emergence of the socialist camp, the ominous threat of a hot war following the Cold War, the new power of the trade unions and other social movements in times of full employment, the independence movement in the Third World, and the planning experiments, for instance, in Cuba, and subsequent debates about its political implications. New Marxist discourses blossomed that had not existed in the period before the Second World War. The theory of monopoly capitalism, as it has been developed by Paul Baran and Paul M. Sweezy in the United States, was a development theory which first gave rise to the desarrollismo in Latin America and later was developed to the dependency theory. These new theoretical approaches were adopted with enthusiasm by the young intellectuals of Europe after decades of theoretically unsatisfactory debates. In a short period of time at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 60s dominated the illusion that the business cycle was dead and that the economic miracle will last forever. But the end of history did not come in the 60s, as it did not happen 30 years later, although proudly announced by neo-Hegelians like Francis Fukuyama. Instead, the business cycle was alive, and the crisis of 1966 surprised the majority of contemporary economists. The normality of capitalism was back. Ernest Mandel, on the contrary, was not surprised about this development. He expected the end of the economic miracles. In a small book on the first post-war crisis, he explained it as an expression of the reality of capitalist laws of motion. And that was the beginning of the Marxist Renaissance. The bipolar world is reflected also in the different Marxisms emerging in the Western and Eastern orbit, in China, also in Latin America. The theory of state monopolistic capitalism, on the one hand, was theoretically the attempt to develop categories of interpreting contemporary capitalist accumulation tendencies, and also interpreting class constellations in modern societies. On the other hand, it was a theoretical approach to substantiate anti-monopolistic alliances. The latter became the centerpiece of political strategies, especially of Soviet Communist parties in the West. In the first decades after the devastating Second World War, there emerged a certain Soviet Marxism, as it later has been dubbed by Herbert Marcuse, which pushed many of the emancipatory concepts contained in the dialectics of Marx and Engels into background. For it was not easy to criticize the capitalist world and not to adopt the theory and the resulting strategic conclusions of Soviet Marxism. There emerged a certain mistrust of the younger generation to closed or hermetic theories and constrained political concepts. A new left was born, which understood itself as undogmatic, anti-authoritarian, and emancipatory. This new left was open towards new theory offers and therefore also open to the Marxism offered by Ernest Mandel. But only a minority, in France it was larger than in Germany, has drawn the conclusion to join the Trotskyist cause international. The stable and accelerated development of capital, of course, was a strong challenge for the critique of political economy after the end of the Second World War. It had to be taken seriously. How can you explain why economic growth rates remain unexpectedly high more than 2 decades until the second half of the 1960s? Higher than ever before in 300 years of capitalist development, when you further rely on the theoretical concept of the average profit rate to decline. Mandel accepted these challenges and discussed them in innumerable publications, lectures, seminars. He participated in many theoretical, methodological, political debates which have their specific historical coloring and therefore today sometimes are not easy to understand. Some were highlights in the discussion, the Marxist discussion of the last centuries, of the last decades, not centuries, last decades, like the conference which took place in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Capital, publication day of the Capital. 1970 was not 1967, that was exactly 100 years after the publication of the Capital of Marx in Tilburg in the Netherlands. And on this conference also Ernest Mandel and many other Marxist writers took place. That was what happened, and then in this situation of a new beginning of Marxist debates and Marxist thinking, Ernest Mandel was punished by the then already mentioned, by the then announced by the German social liberal government. Despite the very serious and energy-draining predator and robber games which began after the ban, because Ernest Mandel did not accept the ban, he was several times in France illegally, and you have to read the biography of Jan Wilhelm Stoetje about these robber and predator games between the police and Ernest Mandel. Is very nice to read, although it must not have been very nice for Ernest Mandel in those times when it happened. But he used this time also to write a lot of publications. He intervened into the international debates of the New Left. One of his theses was that the internationalization of forces of production and of capital opens the space for the third technological revolution as a main trend of post-war capitalism. This was a quotation. In his late Capitalism, its earlier published book on the EEC, the European Economic Community, and the competition of Europe, America, he also predicted the decline of hegemony of the United States and the dwindling capabilities of the nation state to intervene into economic development. He was right, even if he underestimated perhaps the extent of the withdrawal of the state from the economy and the radical nature of market dominance in neoliberalism, which only began in the 70s, and that was the time when Ernest Mandel already had published some of his most important books. When Ernest Mandel in the second decade of the 21st century would write a book on late capitalism, that is today, he would have to again mention the dwindling hegemony of the United States and to add the question, why the hegemony over half a century fades, but still until the present did not really disappear. That is a question of Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin in their book on US-American hegemony and crisis. Their answer is very different from that of Ernest Mandel some decades earlier. The hegemony of the United States seems them unabated. There are good arguments in favor and good arguments supporting the skeptical view of Ernest Mandel, which is, by the way, shared by the judgment of writers like Immanuel Wallerstein and many others. The question of US hegemony today cannot seriously be discussed without taking the role of financial capital and the credit markets into account, without analyzing the financial and currency crisis and their destructive dynamics, and especially without touching upon the nationalization of the private financial crisis by transforming it into the sovereign debt crisis. This development has led many liberals to raise the question, if not more, Keynesian interventions for economic development were advantageous. And some even ask whether Marx may not have right. This debate on what are the reasons of the crisis and the way to overcome it. Mandel does not study the financialization of modern capitalism. For him, the real economy, so-called real economy, is clearly in the foreground. And this also applies to the acting subjects. These are the capitalist class and the working class. In this respect, Mandel argues very capitalism by various authors has been similarly described as Ernest Mandel did. The assessment of the immanent laws of motion, of the historical dynamics and the determination of historical subjects who set it into motion are very different and thus controversial. The differences are due to the different understanding of the finality of capitalism, of its overcoming and of the really existing socialism as a post-capitalist reality. In the critique of capitalism are areas of agreement between the theorists of various political provenance. In describing the Soviet Union, the agreement became more seldom, and the often fierce clashes began. A large part of the writings of Ernest Mandel explicitly addresses the problem of a powerful and not very flexible central bureaucracy and the shortcomings of Soviet planning, but also the economic and in some cases also political reforms in Eastern Europe since the 1960s. And he works about the reasons and the consequences of the end of socialism in 1989. The different approaches in analyzing and criticizing capitalism had their impact on the analytical categories. while in the theories of monopoly capitalism, there were mostly two or more phases or stages of capitalist development distinguished. Ernest Mandel elaborated on a theory of long waves. And you remember, you know, that he received the Alfred Marshall Award for his lecture, which became also a book on the long waves in the Cambridge University, and the prize, the Alfred Marshall Prize for it. The long waves are the expression of an epistemological different approach, epistemologically different approach to the analysis of the history of capitalism, because long waves mean capitalism remains until the socialist revolution, and you have to fight against this capitalism, and there are not these stages which allow to change the strategy from in earlier times revolutionary to a reformist or something else strategy of fighting against capitalism. A revolutionary strategy is required in order to surmount the mishaps and crises of late capitalism. Marx referred, Ernest Mandel referred in his analysis of the long waves to rather cursory remarks of Trotsky and other Trotsky's writers like Tardío, and also modern writers, and he worked it out, showing that these long waves always had a phase of stagnative nature and another of boom nature. And long waves come to an end due to interior or internal mechanisms, but there are the internal mechanisms not sufficient in order to initiate a new upswing of the economy. That was his main thesis. Well, the subject of this lecture is dissemination of Mandel. And I have to say that as a student movement radicalized in the early 1960s, also the need for theory grew. In some places, theoretical study circles formed mostly outside the universities. As a movement, as extra-parliamentary opposition was stronger, clubs like a Republican club in Berlin or other clubs have been founded to disseminate theories, critical theories among the new movement. Ernest Mandel was very often guest speaker before he was banned from entering the Federal Republic. In these clubs, you always have many listeners. The ban has been pronounced by a minister of the Interior, who was a member of the Liberal Party, and that was also one of the reasons of criticizing the German government. Mandel was like a catalyst in this dissemination process, the catalyst of re-importing critical and Marxist theory to West Germany and to other countries in Europe as well. In this respect, he can only be compared with the Italian socialist and Luxembourgian, I would say, Lelio Basso, publisher in Italian, English and French, the very influential international socialist journal. In Germany, a movement of the critical reception of Marx's writings developed under left students since the early 1960s, and Ernest Mandel was always with them. Not at least because he perfectly spoke German as he spoke many other languages. I was here at the UNAM once in the 70s, no, in the 80s, when he spoke in Spanish on the campus of the UNAM. And I was by accident also in Paris when he participated in a meeting and he spoke French, or in Italy when he spoke Italian, and also shortly before his death, 1995, in Marília, in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, where he not spoke Portuguese, but fluent English. Well, he was polyglot, cosmopolite, and that was important for the dissemination of his ideas, but without the content of his writing, without the theoretical strength of that what he did, without the epistemological validity, he would not have been so successful as he had been. So the capitalism changed a lot after the Second World War, and Ernest Mandel was one of the most important persons who analyzed the changes of capitalism in order to draw consequences out of it, strategical consequences out of it. And so far, he follows the idea of Karl Marx, who said that the capital is the most effective, efficient missile what has been thrown at the head of the bourgeois. That was a letter which Marx wrote about the capital. It was a missile in class struggle. So it was not only theory as theory, but it was an instrument in class struggle, and Ernest Mandel understood his theoretical work also as an instrument in class struggle. But his idea of class struggle was very particular and not so easy to understand today. His theoretical contributions were always also agitation. The Fourth International could imagine social change, the revolution, but only as an act organized by a party, or at least by a strong political movement, party-like. That was also Ernest Mandel's conviction. This position, however, was not acceptable in the student movement of the 60s and early 70s. It is so then in the authoritarian form of Maoist, Marxist, Leninist parties, which by definition were hostile against Trotsky's initiatives. Hardly anyone wanted to organize themselves in political parties or practice the strategy of entryism preferred by the Fourth International and enter into social democracy to make a left current there. Mandel criticized the socialist student movement in Germany, for instance, because of the reluctance to transform the student movement into a kind of a party. And I remember Mandel on the way to a debate at the Free University, Berlin, on the back seat, in a crowded, I think 6 people at least, in a Volkswagen Beetle, at the end of the 60s, accusing the socialist student movement in Germany because of the missed opportunity to transform the movement into a powerful organization. That was just shortly, only weeks before the self-liquidation of the SDS in 1969. The transformation of the movement into a political party was not possible, so straightforward as Ernest Mandel imagined. The class relations had changed significantly. The nouvelle classe ouvrière was born, as it has been called by Turenne, others, and André Gorz. and new social movements with a whole new understanding of politics now populating the political arena. New social movement, environmental groups, peace movement, the women's movement, and the Greens, which came into existence in Germany at the beginning of the 80s, and 83 first time into the parliament. So we have to say that Ernest Mandel's theoretical and historical findings at least have a long half-life. Mandel's analysis of the European communities and their contradictions, the competition of Europe and the USA are still valuable contributions to better understand the economic, social and political history of post-war Europe and of the post-war world. Who today will analyze the integration of Europe and its difficulties has to take Mandel's analysis of the European Union into consideration, and he will profit from doing that. The more shameful, therefore, is how the ruling elites in Germany dealt with this intelligent thinker and internationally recognized scientist. He submitted, as I already told you, his manuscript on the late capitalism 40 years ago as a dissertation, as a doctoral thesis at the Otto Institute of the Free University Berlin. The composition of the board of the doctoral examination, so-called Promotionskommission, was not materialized without intrigues, especially since the Commission had to travel to Brussels for the disputation, as Ernest Mandel was a persona non grata in Germany, and he was therefore not allowed to come to Berlin. The dissertation, the book about the late capitalism, has been translated into many languages of the world, has influenced the theoretical debates around the world, but hardly anyone knows that it has been written as a doctoral thesis at the Free University Berlin. There would be a late apology of the representatives of the Free University not out of place, even though it no longer reaches Ernest Mandel, because he died in 1995. Thank you for your